So I see here that there are 30 trig problems, and I'm just going to get a quick glance of it before the 10 minutes start. Here we go. So starting with the radians, we know that tangent of any fourth is going to be 1 or -1, and it depends on the quadrant. So 5 pi over 4 is in the third quadrant where tangent is positive. So cosine of pi is on the left side of a unit circle, so that's -1. Let's see, so 4/3, so cosine of a third, that is 1/2. So 4/3 is going to be in the third quadrant, which would make it -1/2. And then cosine of a sixth, that is square root of 3 over 2. Now 7/6, that's in the third quadrant, which makes cosine negative. So tangent of 3 pi, so tangent of 0, pi, 3 pi, it goes back and it's actually 0, because tangent's always the y over the x. And at 0, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, the y is always 0. So it's 0 divided by, well, 1 or -1, so this is always going to be 0. So pi over 4, so with both sine and cosine, it's going to be square root of 2 over 2. So in the first quadrant, sine's positive. So cosine of 2/3, you saw up here, it's going to be 1/2. So this is in the second quadrant, which makes cosine negative. Then the sine of a sixth, so sine of a sixth is 1/2. 11/6 is in the fourth quadrant, which sine is negative. So tangent at any half, whether it be pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, or 5 pi over 2, this is always undefined because the x value is negative. So it'd be 1 or -1 over 0, which make it undefined. So then sine of a third, so sine of a third is going to be square root of 3 over 2. 5 pi over 3, that is in the fourth quadrant, which is where sine is negative. So then over here, looking at sine of 0, sine of 0 is going to be 0. So -5/3. So again, sine of +5/3, so we know it's going to be square root of 3 over 2. So it's a matter of positive or negative. So it's going in the opposite direction. So the negative simply refers to the opposite direction. So this would take me from the fourth, the third, second, to the first quadrant where sine is positive. So here, tangent, again, over 2, it's going to be undefined. And then sine of a half, this is either going to be +1 or -1. So sine of a half is going to be +1 or -1. So going 3/2, so we're going backwards. So 1/2 is -1. Then we have 3/2, that's going to be +1. And then we have a fourth, so that's going to be square root of 2 over 2. Whether it's positive or negative, let's find out. So this is 3/4, which is typically that's in the second quadrant, but going in the opposite direction, that's going to be in the third quadrant where cosine is negative. So up here, now we're looking at degrees, switching colors. So now we're looking at degrees. So tangent of 90, this is again this would be pi over 2. So tangent of any half is going to be undefined. Okay, sine of 180. So this is a -180. So this is going this way, so it's where the pi is located. So sine of 180 or sine of pi is 0. So I see the 35. So this is relative to 45. So this is square root of 2 over 2. So going -135. So from the fourth quadrant, that's -90. So -135 is in the third quadrant, which is cosine's negative. So tangent of -330. So -330 is from the fourth quadrant to the third quadrant to the second quadrant. So we're in the first quadrant. So this thing. So to get to 360, I'd have to add 30 more. So this is relative to 30. So tangent of 30, that's what we're looking at here. Tangent of 30 essentially. So tangent of 30, okay, so sine of 30 is 1/2. and then cosine of 30 is square root of 3 over 2. So when doing this, the 2's cancel, so this ends up just being 1 over the square root of 3. So tangent of 30 is 1 over the square root of 3, so is tangent of negative 330. So cosine of negative 220. So negative 220, so that takes us from the fourth quadrant, third quadrant, so we're in the second quadrant, and past 180, we've gone 30 more. So this is essentially cosine of 30, which is the square root of 3 over 2, and in the second quadrant, cosine's negative. So back over here, so looking at sine of 300, so now we're back to positive angle measures at the top. So sine of 180, so that's going this way, we're on the left side, so that sine is 0. So I see a 5, which means that this is relative to 45, so it's square root 2 over 2. It's relative to 45, what quadrant are we in? This would be the fourth quadrant, so cosine is positive. So tangent of 120, so tangent of 120, that's in the second quadrant, which we know tangent here is going to be negative. We know that tangent in the second quadrant is negative. So this, though, is relative to 60 degrees because it makes 180. So tangent of 60 degrees. So I'm relating it back to that. So tangent of 60, that would be sine of 60. That's square root of 3 over 2. And then cosine of 60 is 1/2. So simplifying this, it would be just square root of 3 over 1. But with 120 degrees, this is going to be negative square root of 3 over 1. Cosine of 120. So cosine of 120 we just did doing this previous problem. Cosine of 120, that's in the second quadrant. It's relative to 60, so cosine of 60 is 1/2, but in the second quadrant it is negative. So 390, so that's one full rotation. So if I take 360 away from this, that's actually cosine of 30. So cosine of 30 is going to be square root of 3 over 2, and we're still in the first quadrant, so cosine is positive. And then 25, so that's relative to 45, so this is going to be square root of 2 over 2. But 225, that is in the, not the first, not the second, that's in the third quadrant, where sine is negative. So sine of 30, we're in the first quadrant. Sine of 30 is 1/2, and we are positive. So 270, that is on the y-axis. So that's on the y-axis. And so tangent on the pi over 2 or the 3 pi over 2, this is going to be undefined. So when tangent's on that vertical axis, it is undefined. Cosine of 90, it is going to be 0. And then sine of 300, so sine of 300 is 60 away from 360, so sine of 60 is square root of 3 over 2, but in the fourth quadrant, sine is negative. So under 10 minutes, we have our 30 questions. So I'm going to just add here what I was referring to this whole entire time. Okay, so at 0, 2 pi, 4 pi, it is always 1, 0. At pi over 6 or 30 degrees, it is square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. So cosine, sine. At 45 or pi over 4, it is square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2 for cosine and sine. For pi over 3 or 60 degrees, it is going to be 1/2 and then square root of 3 over 2. So here cosine's 1/2, sine is 3/2. And for pi over 2 or 90 degrees, it is going to be 0, 1. So I used this the whole entire time. I just related everything back to this first quadrant, and then I determined what the sign of that is, whether it be positive or negative, or for tangent, undefined. Tangent, again, is undefined. Every time you're on this vertical axis, it is 0. Every time you're on this horizontal axis, and it is 1 at every pi over 4. It will just change sign with what it is. So this is 30 questions under 10 minutes. Hope this helps.